Thanks everyone for being here. We really appreciate it. If I were to name every award that Walt and Sandra have won, I think we'd be here till probably the wee hours of the night, but they're both award-winning investigative reporters, as I think Brenda may have said, but Sandra works with me at Newsday, and Walt works for News 12, New Jersey. He has a segment which has been on for years, is Kane in Your Corner. Guys, welcome. Thanks for being here. My first question is, what makes a good investigative reporter? And Walt, I'll start with you.
You know, when I've tried to define investigative reporting, I think for me, it's about trying to get to the truth, really. I mean, in its simplest form, it's getting beyond the he said, she said, report both sides equally. Not that reporting both sides equally isn't important, but sometimes one side's telling the whole truth and one side's telling half the truth, or one side's just outright lying. So you sort of need to get past that. I think what makes a good investigative reporter is a natural curiosity, a willingness to dig and try to get beyond the surface level, get the facts. And I think you have to have a thick skin, because you're never going to please everybody. And in fact, when somebody comes back to me and says, "Oh, thank you, I thought you were really fair," I always wonder, like, maybe I missed something, because fair to the person I'm investigating may not be fair to somebody else.
I have a reporter friend who I think on one story, both sides, complained about something. And she's like, that's wearing that as the badge of honor. That means
no problem with that. Yeah.
And Sandra, what do you think?
Well, I agree with Walt. I think you have to have a thick skin, and I don't think you get that thick skin right away. I have many layers of thick skin that I've earned over the years because people assume that reporters aren't human. I think the other thing that you have to have is you have to have an outrage meter. The stories have to outrage you. And for me, it's what keeps me going. It's just this outrage that whatever I'm writing about has happened. So those are the two key things, I think.
I guess, from a purely technical standpoint, you have to be able to synthesize a lot of information and kind of find the nugget of truth, and it helps if you can do that relatively quickly, because there's so much paperwork.
So I think a lot of us wonder, those of us who just really don't, are churning out stories, maybe one a day, two a day. How do you find your ideas? How do you have the time to? Can you kind of take us through that process? I'm assuming with both of you that people, come to you because you're both well known in your fields, but.
Well, it's true. People do come to us, and they come to us not just because of our reputations, but because of the institutions we represent. News 12 and Newsday are obviously very, very well known. But it's also a matter of reading a lot, talking to people, taking sources out to breakfast and lunch. And it's juggling a lot of balls. There's this myth that investigative reporters get to work on one story for months and months and months. And sometimes that's true, but I know for me, and I'm guessing the same is true for Walt, that I'm working on at least 3 or 4 things at once, and trying to keep a lot of balls in the air. And sometimes that's confusing, but it's the only way to be productive, I think.
Yeah, we're usually working on multiple pieces. Sometimes up on our board that we use, which is now virtual. It used to be the old whiteboard. We probably have like 20 or 25 things at any one time. Now, we're not necessarily actively working on all of them. We're probably working on like 6 or 7, because I try to be on the air a lot. I try to be on a minimum of twice a week. And in order to do that, you need a mix of, some of them are quick turn pieces that are only going to take a day or two to begin with. Others are pieces you've worked on at length. Then there's a follow-up to the piece that you did. So you have to constantly, be juggling where the stories come from. Yeah, some of them come from tips. A lot of them do. I've never really figured out like the percentage of it. Probably most. But then, as Sandra said, sometimes you're reading. You see something in the budget, and you think, oh, that might be something that's worth investigating. Or there's breaking news, and so you just whenever news breaks in New Jersey, my producer or I will quickly try to take a look. Are there stats? Or are there safety records? Are there inspection reports? And sometimes a story comes from there.
Are there particular places you can divulge where you tend to go just to see if anything's going on? Like, for example, some community group on Facebook, or maybe a mom's page, or just like, is there a place where you guys tend to look when you're seeking out ideas?
Well, I tend to be a little bit wonky, and I tend to look at payrolls and budgets, and that sounds terribly boring, but you really can't go wrong with a payroll on Long Island because the salaries are so high. But also, I do look at Facebook a lot, the different kinds of groups that I think we would all be interested in. I think for me, the really compelling investigative stories have a human component, have a victim. And you find a lot of that on Facebook, Instagram accounts, places like that.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that sometimes you can, as Sandra mentioned, payroll. We put out a lot of open records requests.
Yeah.
New Jersey, it's called OPRA, Open Public Records Act, as opposed to FOIA or FOIL in New York. But yeah, I mean, I feel like I've done it for a lot of years. I feel like I still miss the boat, on a lot of those open records requests. It's, there'll be a story in the news cycle, and like, you have to sort of, see it. Like, should we put an over request in for the dash cam footage of that police event? Or I wonder how often this happens. Maybe we should put an over in to get the number of, of course you can't request the number, but you have to request, the reports, but then you can figure out from that how often the situation occurs. Is it a chronic problem? Is it a one-off? So a lot of times, the best stories come from just that sort of organic checking rather than a tip. But then, if you want the victim, sometimes the tip is tremendous. Somebody has a really compelling human story. And then, you can jump off and do the bigger issue from there.
So go ahead, Sandra.
I have about, right now, 40 Freedom of Information law requests pending for records. So that's a lot, and I literally keep track of them on a spreadsheet. And I think it's a really good thing for people to put out Freedom of Information requests all the time. I think I've mentioned this in the past, but one thing that I know reporters do is they'll put in a records request for all the other records requests that an agency might have received in the last 6 months or a year. And then you can find out what other reporters are doing. And sometimes they're good ideas, sometimes they're not such good ideas, but at least you'll know what people are doing.
Along those same lines, one of the other things that we've sometimes started to do is, after we've put the request in, if the agency is pushing back and there's back and forth, we'll put in an open records request for any communication that included News 12 or my name or my producer's name. And then we'll find out what it was that they didn't want to tell us or what they were talking about.
Yeah. Emails and text messages are always good to ask for.
We hear from reporters a lot who put those requests in and they just never hear back. What has that happened to you, and what do you do?
Well, they do try to ignore it, but under the law, at least in New York, I'm not familiar with New Jersey law, but in New York, they're required to respond within 30 business or 20 business days, which is essentially a month. And so one of the reasons I have a spreadsheet, I have the date of the Freedom of Information request, the date of acknowledgement, and so I can watch the clock. And if they go over that mark, I'll send them a follow-up email saying, okay, what's the status of this request? You're now in violation of the law. And that usually shakes people up a little bit, because what happens, I think, with a lot of Freedom of Information requests is that you put them in, you're moving on to another story, and you might forget about it. And they're sort of counting on that.
Yes.
But if you keep track of it, have your own little calendar and do follow-ups, they respond. The other thing I've done is, when I know that a particular Freedom of Information officer might be sort of political, I'll talk to that person's political leader and say, this person's not being very cooperative, and boom, I'll get responses. So there are different ways to put pressure on.
Yeah, we put ours in a Google Calendar. So basically the same thing, when it's due, and then if there's an extension, we move it to the extension date, but we put in the notes, when the original request was and what came of it. In New Jersey, it's 7 business days. So it's on paper, it's a great law, but they can request extensions. And the first extension is pretty much automatic. If they say we need an extension of, 14 days or anything up to about a month, there's not much you can do about it. You can deny it, but the courts would say that you're the one who's being unreasonable, at least in New Jersey. So they can sort of make it, like 5 weeks if they really want to. If they come back though at that point and say, well, we need another extension, well, you need to tell me why, because you picked this date now. You said you would have it by the second day. So if you can't have it, what, one of the things that I'll do that, is I'll say, okay, we can't grant the second request. However, please give me the list of proactive steps that you've taken and the reason for the unforeseen event that's causing your need for an extension. Otherwise, we'll have to say it's deemed denied and you're in violation of them.
And one thing that I have done, and because it's common for agencies to just ignore you. So for example, I'm trying to get records out of county police departments. They're ignoring me. Well, there happen to be 37 village police departments on Long Island. So I sent that same request to 37 village police departments, and they all got their knickers in a twist. And, cops are big gossips.
Right.
That I was able to shake loose some records, and then at least one of the counties responded. So whenever one agency is ignoring me, I will try to go to a state agency or another level and ask for the same records to put pressure on them. And that sometimes works.
So I think one of the hardest things that journalists go through, especially when I was at the assignment desk at News 12, is you get so many tips flooding in. And some of these stories almost sound so crazy, you don't believe them. Some of them you just, you don't believe, you might think somebody has an agenda. How do you filter through, assuming you guys both get tons of tips all the time? Have you learned any tricks sort of to be able to, and a lot of times it's over the phone, right? How do you know if somebody is, there's this story is authentic or not?
It's tricky because we get a couple of hundred of them a month, and it's just me and my producer. So, one of the things we'll ask for is, we'll send a response. We'll ask for some sort of documentation. You've got to have something, and if the response we get is, well, you're the investigative reporter, okay, then you don't have anything. You have a wild theory that something may be going on, and I can't necessarily act on it. But send whatever documents you have. What kind of evidence do you have? And we'll at least kind of vet it from there. And then if it seems good, then, we'll start putting in records requests, or we'll try to see what we can find. And then maybe we'll go out, we'll shoot the interview. There are some stories, like I said, because I'm trying to get on like at least twice a week. We're in the market for some quick turn investigations too. So, is this something, maybe it's a consumer piece, but is it something that's pretty straightforward? They're saying they were ripped off by the company. Well, how many complaints have there been against the company? Okay, 362. What's their rating with the Better Business Bureau? They have an F. Okay, this one looks pretty good. We can go and interview the person. We know at the very least we'll have a story.
I agree with Walt. I do the very same thing. And I think one place where I get a lot of calls that are difficult to handle are when you get calls from people who are involved in custody disputes or divorce cases. And in New York, divorce cases are not public. And those custody disputes are always very difficult because, it's very emotional. And I just got a call yesterday where this woman was saying, well, there's corruption. Well, okay, based on what? Based on what facts? And you try to drill down. And my inclination is to stay away from those cases because they're he said, she said. But I force myself to listen and try to ask for documents because I'm sure there is corruption going on. But unless I can get something specific, it's difficult for me to do anything. And I also think it's important when people call, I think it's important to listen with kindness and compassion. I think even if I can't do a story, or if I don't feel that something that someone is telling me is a story, I want them to leave the phone call at least feeling heard and feeling like they were treated with respect. I think that's really important. I don't know if it does anything in terms of getting more calls or anything like that, but I think that's a really important thing to do for any reporter. And it can be frustrating because people who are in very emotional situations can be abusive. And
Mhm.
I understand that, but it bothers me because I do think that there are stories there, but unless there's some kind of documentation or data or something, they're very hard to get at.
It's tricky though, because at the same time, and this is where it's such an inexact science, and it's not really science at all, actually. But one of the stories that I tell when I do training with younger journalists is 10 years ago we did an investigation into a disastrous landfill cleanup and redevelopment project in New Jersey involving public-private partnerships. And that tip, it came in from a couple of people who said, we live near a landfill and the smell is making us sick. And I thought, I don't know if I could care less about a story than this. It's they're living near a landfill and complaining about the smell. But my producer liked it. And Karen and I have been together 10 and a half years, which means we were together about a month and a half when this tip came in. So she pitched it and I said, I don't know. And so but if you like it, let's make some calls, see what you can find out. And she came back and said, I really can't find anything, but I just have a feeling there's something there. And I wanted her to, I wanted her to know that I respected her judgment. So I said, okay, let's do it. And that wound up being this massive corruption story that led to changes in New Jersey environmental law. And it was mostly because I wanted my producer to know I respected her judgment that we did it. So there's no, I know that there are good stories that we're passing on, but we can't necessarily investigate them all. And so you triage them and, you don't know what you don't know.
So one thing I'm really curious about, and I've struggled with this on a day-to-day basis, but with you guys in particular, so you're spending a lot of time, at least Sandra, I know a lot of your stories you've spent like months and months on. Walt, I don't know the longest you've spent, but if you're going to be covering something explosive, you don't always want to reach out to the other side right away.
Right.
So my question to you is, what amount of time is fair to give the other side, whatever it is, to respond before it goes to print or on air?
Right. I mean, I guess the story, it all depends on, a number of factors, including how long you're doing this, you're working on the story for. If it's a project that, is somewhat time sensitive and we're starting on it on Monday, and we want to get it done on the air that week, then, I won't do some of the stuff I had to do when I was general assignment, where it's like, you have until the end of the day. I think that we need to give them, obviously more time than that. If it's a piece that we've spent a couple of weeks on, then when we get to the other side, we might want to give them a week. We might say on Friday, could please respond by end of day Thursday. And if Thursday comes, they say they need more time. It's like, okay, you want to be reasonable, because if I've spent weeks researching a piece, I don't know how reasonable it is to think that the other side can respond in a day. They may need more time. On the other hand, sometimes, what you're asking for, and are they aware? Should they be aware? You can't let them run out the clock, but I do think you have to be fair and give them time. Along those lines, the other big thing that we believe in is no surprises. If we're doing a story, we're not going to say we're doing a story about your work and then show up and try to go for the gotcha moment. I mean, we'll tell you, we're looking into allegations that you embezzled money from this nonprofit that you run, and we understand that there are two sides to the story. We'd like to get your side, because I try to be empathetic. How would I feel if somebody was investigating me and I thought they were doing a profile piece on me, and then they suddenly are pulling out documents and throwing evidence at me that I'm not prepared to answer? So I want to be fair.
I would agree with Walt. Excuse me, I've got a tickle. I would agree with Walt. I think the amount of time you give them depends upon the timing of the story, how much time you've spent. But I also agree that you want to give the target or targets enough time to absorb what you're doing. The fear I think we all have as reporters is that they're going to fix it before the story runs. And they really can't in the most part, but even if they do something, you can say, well, they made the change after being approached by
Right.
reporters and
Or,
whatever.
or they fixed it for this one person who, but they're not going to fix a whole systemic problem.
Yeah, but so, and I just had an experience in doing a story about Bitcoin, illegal Bitcoin mining in a government building. I asked for interviews with multiple county officials over 3 weeks. I kept on asking for interviews, and they just ignored us. They completely ignored me. And then finally, it was going to run over Easter weekend, and so they decided to send a statement on the Saturday before Easter, just to screw up our weekend. I mean, that was the editor's perception. So they play games too. It's not just and when I say play games, I don't think I'm playing games, but your target will sometimes play games with that kind of stuff, and you have to be mindful of that. And we, bent over backwards. We got the statement in. We changed the video to reflect the statement. We were far more fair than we were really needed to be in that situation, but we did it.
But I think that's the right thing. I totally
Yeah.
agree. You probably should be more fair than you need to be.
Yeah, you want to bend over backwards to be fair.
So I think a lot of us who do day of air stories can relate because, for example, TV world, you want to get, if there's maybe breaking news. So let's say an attorney suddenly has a crazy press conference with explosive allegations about somebody or a public official. It doesn't matter. I'll make a point of, like, let's say the press conference ends and they want me live in an hour. I'll call the person who's accused of A, B, and C. And obviously, by the time I'm going live an hour later, I don't have a response, but I'll always try to make a point to say, we haven't heard back, but we only just reached out, just so the public knows that we're being, as honest as we can and transparent as we can.
Right. I remember when I was a younger reporter, I showed up once. I was working a night shift, came in at 2:00, and they wanted a story for 5. And I called the principal and I said, it was at a school. I called the principal. He didn't hear back, and they were saying, "All right, well, he didn't return comment." It's like, wait a minute, time out. We called him an hour before school ended. I don't know that we can do a piece at 5:00 and say the principal didn't respond. I mean, we may have to hold this for tomorrow at least.
Yeah.
And one thing to remember, and I've said this to some of my editors over the years, in the case of Newsday, bringing down the hammer of Newsday on someone or News 12, it's a big deal. And so you really do want to give that person some space and time, because for us, it's another story, but for that person, it's something that they're going to remember for the rest of their lives, for better or worse. And so I think it's important to be sensitive to that.
Yes, for TV in particular, and Cecilia, obviously, this, there's also the factor of video, of trying to get the person on camera. And
right.
Yeah.
I will never just show up. I will always call and request the interview first. Does it make it harder to catch the guy? Or sure. But again, it's like, I wouldn't want to be walking out of Home Depot with spackle dust all over me, and then have somebody stick a microphone in my face and start barking questions. If somebody was doing an investigation into me, I would rather they call me first, give me the opportunity to do an interview. And I think we owe the same courtesy to them. I
agree with that. So Walt, you kind of already answered this, but maybe you could choose a different story because you talked about the landfill one, but we all get in this, right? We want to make a difference. What stories have you done, if any, that I think you both have done many, that have actually spurred change?
There was, we've had 13 laws that have come up or changed as a result of our investigations. The landfill one led to environmental cleanup regulations. We did a story, and we're actually, oddly enough, following it up now just this month. In 2014, we did a story on the practice of physical restraint of special needs students, which was happening a lot in New Jersey and which was largely at the time unregulated. And as a result of that, law got passed, requiring, for example, parents had to be notified if their kids were restrained. You couldn't just, because some of these kids are not even, or barely verbal, so you had to notify the parent. You had to follow up with a written report. You couldn't restrain in the prone position, face down, because of the pressure on the chest that, And now we're following up on it 9 years later because it turns out that a lot of those provisions are not really being followed. So, even when you get the law changed, it doesn't necessarily make for lasting change. But then I think we owe it to follow up and see if the reform law is being followed, because it's very easy for politicians to say, okay, we're fixing this, we're putting this new policy in place, or for lawmakers to grandstand and unanimously pass legislation to fix it. But is it really changing anything?
I've also written stories where laws have been changed. Unlike Walt, I haven't kept track and counted how many. I can think of 3 or 4 laws that have been changed, but also.
Yeah, the only reason I know that is my boss asked me to go back and count them earlier this year.
Well, I think that's a good idea. I should go back and count them. But in any case, I've also had politicians go to prison and seen some people lose their jobs, which doesn't make me feel good. That's
Right.
not something that I feel happy about. And I also agree with Walt that you can see a reform in the law, and years later it's not really being abided by. And so, and he's right that we do have a duty to follow up. But I think I would add to that, for me, some of the more profound moments are the really very personal, kind of intimate moments where a victim will tell you what a difference a story has made in their lives. I guess it was about a year ago, I did a story about a woman, Joanna Bird, who was killed by her abusive ex-boyfriend. He stabbed her to death. And it was based on a police file that we hadn't been able to get for years. And we did a collaboration with USA Today on this case. And I interviewed every one of her family members, including her son and daughter. And it was really the first time they had all spoken about their grief and how this horrific crime had affected them even years later. And it was so profound. And they felt it was important to be heard, which, I understand, but it changed me in a way, because for the first time in my life, I understood domestic violence, because fortunately, I don't have experience with domestic violence. And I never understood how a woman could let herself be hit by a man. And then I learned that she didn't let him do anything. She got trapped in this awful situation. So I tell that story because as much as we all want to see our stories have impact, we're also in it because these stories change us.
Yes.
And I want to do stories that make me a better person. And I think that in doing these stories, that's an important goal.
Sorry, I'm unmuting because it's loud where I live. Stories you're proudest of.
We did a piece over the last few years. We did a half-hour primetime special on it just a couple of months ago. It's called Justice Delayed. And it looked at kids who had been, well, they're grown now, but when they were kids, they were sexually abused repeatedly by a county sheriff when they were in the county's custody. And county officials knew about it and really were turning a blind eye to it. I wouldn't say they knew about it. They were warned. They were told it was happening. Maybe they didn't believe it, but they didn't do anything to protect the kids. And 30 years later, the kids were now grown. We're looking for some sort of acknowledgement that it actually happened. And I think that was a story I'm very proud of, because these are people who had never had any sort of voice, and they'd never had any sort of justice. So to be able to give them a voice and to help them get some degree of justice, that meant a lot.
People always ask me the stories that I'm proudest of, and I don't have an answer, because I always fall in love with the next story. And that's all I'm thinking about is, when's the next story going to come along that I'm going to fall in love with and you lose sleep over and be miserable for weeks until it's finally done. And so that's my answer. I really, I'm proud of all my babies.
Yeah, I mean, I picked that one, but I agree. You could find there's something, look, there's some sort of spark in the story to begin with, or you wouldn't have done it. And so, you're excited about it, and something else comes along and you're excited about that. But, we have positions that allow us to do stories that, can directly improve people's lives. And that's, when you do that, it feels good. On the other hand, and I always say this, you can't necessarily count on the result. You can point the problem out, but it's up to somebody else to fix it. And so you have to feel good about the work you did, even when sometimes, on a personal level, you're disappointed because it didn't lead to anything.
I'm going to try to just do 2 or 3 more, and then I'll open it up to 2 questions. But Sandra, we had emailed and you said something important to speak about is that you have to be able to distill your story down to 1 or more sentences, or parts of your story to 1 or more sentences for clarity of writing. And you kind of said it seems counterintuitive, but that's the way it is for print and TV. Can you explain that?
Well, yeah, it's something that I learned over the years because investigative stories are complicated and we all worry about all the nuance and the complications. And unless you can tell that story in 1 or 2 sentences, that means you haven't done enough reporting. You have to be so comfortable with the material you can say it's this. And the reason that's important, it gives you clarity of thought, clarity of writing. Even if I'm writing a 5,000 word piece, I should be able to write in the lead, this is what the story is about. And I say, so it takes a lot of work to make something look simple. And the reason I brought that up is because, we've launched Newsday TV, and we're all getting thrown into the pot. And so I'm writing videos and doing camera work. And it's an important skill for TV reporters. And I've always admired the fact that TV reporters have to do that very thing. You have to be able to synthesize the materials quickly and distill it down to 1 or 2 thoughts. And it seems on the outside, it would seem as if that's not possible with investigative reporting, but it really is. You can do it. And it's important to do it both for print and video.
I think sometimes what we have to do in TV, because I may have 5 minutes to tell a story, which is an enormously long amount of time on TV, but it's not when you're trying to talk about an issue. Sometimes you can break it down and do multiple stories. Sometimes it's the only way to make it work. So like when we did the students restrained follow-up this month, we did 1 story that came back and said, the law says parents have to be notified, but it's still not happening, and then you can do another angle for the other story. It's hard to throw in 4 things. This is wrong, plus this is wrong, plus this is wrong. That's actually probably better for TV if it's 3 stories.
This came from Bill Blyer, who's Sandra, Bill, but we were talking earlier. And can you guys talk through your most complicated and hardest investigation and like the steps you had to do to break the story? Workflow,
Well,
I don't know.
I think of a recent story I did about a county cop who got drunk on St. Patrick's Day, and he was also a volunteer firefighter, and he heard an alarm and he was speeding to the alarm, and he hit a 21-year-old man who was driving down the street in the opposite direction. And he slammed into him, pushed the car into a telephone pole, and they had to remove Julius, the victim, with the jaws of life. And Julius suffered permanent brain injury, brain trauma as a result. And what was key in this story was to get Julius to talk. And first of all, it was a lot of effort to track him down because the court file was very skimpy, and it was hard to find the family and hard to figure out if he had filed suit. So court lawsuits are always a good place to look if you're looking for victims. And so anyway, I finally tracked him down, and then to try to find out where he lived, because he wasn't an affluent family, and less affluent families tend to move around a lot. And I finally tracked down the house where he lived, and I called his mother. I knocked on her door multiple times, and she just wouldn't respond. And I tell this story because there's nothing fancy about it. It's just shoe leather reporting. But I finally knocked on her door when she was home, and I got her, and she opened the door just a crack. And I said, "Hi, I'm Sandra Peddie. I'm here to talk about that cop who got drunk and hit your son and caused permanent brain damage." And she said, "Oh, you mean the one who's a firefighter?" I said, "Yeah, that one too." And she said, "Get your booty in here." And then when it came to doing video, though, she got cold feet, completely cold feet. And usually video is a lot easier. And so I had to go through the same kind of thing, and I had to do a lot of coaxing, and I finally got her to agree to it. We show up at her house and she said, I can't do it. I've got to run to the school. So I said, okay, we'll wait. And she came back and she sees me waiting and she called me up. She said, all right, you can come in. And it was a very compelling video. She was fabulous. My only point is it's just simple perseverance and reporting. And it's hard to do that when you've got a lot of other daily stuff going on. But I did it over a period of weeks while I was doing other things, and it finally landed her.
And Sandra, what do you mean the video is usually easier? I'm not sure if I took the right context out of that, but I actually find on a lot of stories that people will talk to the newspaper, but they won't go on camera.
See, that's so interesting, because I find when I suggest video to people, they kind of perk up and they want to be on video, you know.
Okay. That's interesting.
So it may be a mix. In this case, and it turned out she was fabulous on video, but it took a long time to get her to agree.
Guys, I have like a million more questions, but it's already 7:40. So does anybody in the audience have questions?
So yeah, how are you?
Good to see you.
Likewise, I used to work with Cecilia. I was a freelance reporter at 12 Long Island long ago, and I just left CNN last month. This is a great panel. Thank you for doing this. I have two questions, but if there are others waiting, I'll just do the one. My first question is, are there times that you would ever let the subject of an investigation know front that you are doing a story on them? I've heard some people at IRE who embrace that philosophy, and I just wonder if anybody else here does.
You mean at the beginning of the investigation?
Yeah, saying we are working on a story. I don't know how much you give out, but letting them know, because they're going to hear from friends and associates anyway that someone is going around asking questions, and maybe they do want to sit down with you at some point, or maybe they don't. But I just I heard that in recent years from some folks at IRE, and that made me think a bit.
I don't particularly like doing that, because I know that if I call someone or if I ask for records, their friends and family members whom I call will be telling them. So for example, I was doing a story about a mobster, Sonny Francis, and I called about 30 of his family members and friends, and they all called him, and he never told them not to talk to me. And had he told them that, he would have shut it down. So I think the value of not telling that person is by the time you arrive, there's sort of an inevitability about what you're doing. They know that you're going to do something, and they can decide to either comment or not comment. And what I always say to people is, listen, I'm doing this story with or without you. You can get on the train, you can influence the way it comes out, or you can say no comment. I don't really care. I've got a story with or without you.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely believe in, I guess it sort of depends on how you define upfront. I definitely believe in telling the subject of the story that we're working on an investigation into their conduct, and at least a thumbnail sketch of what it is that we're investigating, because I think they have a right to know that. It's not going to be necessarily the very first call I make, though. I mean, you know, I may try to gather some information first and see if there's something there. But yeah, before we approach them, certainly, we want to let them know. And, you know, along the lines of what Sandra said is, you know, we'll request the interview, always request the interview before we show up. And then if they don't return the call, or if they say, here's a written statement, then at that point, I'll have a discussion with, you know, our senior leadership in terms of, is that sufficient? I mean, it may be, sometimes it may be, sometimes it isn't. And if the decision is that it's not sufficient, we need to really try to effort more of that to try to get an on-camera interview, whatever, then I'll have the conversation that Sandra kind of described with a video twist to it, which is, look, we don't believe that the written statement suffices here. We believe that because of the nature of this story, we need to make an effort to try to interview you. And I would really prefer if we could do this in a scheduled fashion, like let's set up a date, let's set up a time. We'll come to you. If you want to come to us, you can come to us. We can pick a location. We'll set up lights. You can dress how you want to look. We'll, you know, if the other alternative is that we try to pursue an on-camera interview without your cooperation, and I don't want to do that, and you don't want me to do that. Sometimes that works. Sometimes they just say, whatever, do what you have to do. But, you know, and then at that point, especially if they're a public figure, they'll be at an event of some sort. You know, if they're a politician, you can always catch up with them. That, you know, it's just a matter of when. But again, I like I said earlier, I would not want to be walking out of Home Depot with spackle dust on me and have a news crew sticking a microphone in my face. If I've told you that I need to talk to you and that, you know, we're going to try to pursue the interview with or without your cooperation, and we really would prefer to sit, and you choose to say, well, do what you have to do, then I guess I'm doing what I have to do. We still don't want to make the person look bad, but, you know, I did offer the opportunity to do an on-camera interview in a scheduled fashion.
And Ethan has one more question, but I just want to jump in there. I'm curious for you guys, if you have someone who's just not answering your calls, do you have like a number in mind? Like, should I call them 10 times before the story goes to print or to air? 5 times is enough, or maybe 5 calls, an email, a text? I'm just curious if you guys sort of have something. I always wonder how many times is enough.
I mean, it depends on the story, you know, and it depends on how long you're working on it. If it's a one-day story, then 3, 4, or 5 times in the space of a day is probably enough. If it's a week, then maybe you call, you know, once or twice a day, you know. If it's a longer form investigation, yeah, you leave a couple of voicemails, texts, emails, you try to, you know, I mean, there was one story where I was trying to talk to a doctor and we called his office. I looked up his home number, called him his home, sent him emails. At one point I showed up and stuck a note under his door. So he knew. And then again, at that point, when I finally caught up with him walking to his office and he said, I think it's inappropriate for you to be ambushing people like this. I was able to say, you know, we've been calling you for weeks. We've sent you texts, emails, voicemails. Why haven't you returned any of them? And at least it allows you to blunt that criticism, which is that we're out there ambushing people and doing gotcha journalism.
True.
I think the key is not so much the number, but the way you try to communicate. So I always try to call, email, text. I'll do snail mail. Because I don't know if a person is listening to their phone or reads their email or whatever. Some people are, you know, don't pay attention to certain things. So I just try to vary it, give them plenty of opportunities. I don't write out every question when I'm seeking those responses, but I do try to give them a sense of, you know, I'm doing a story about what you did, blah, 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 and enough to get a response.
Ethan, you want to go with your second one?
Quickly, I want to follow up. Thank you for that on Walt's points. It sounds like while there are exceptions that you will make in extraordinary circumstances for the unscheduled interview, or what some people would call the confrontational interview or the ambush interview. I know 60 Minutes, for example, has kind of moved away from that. But if you've got somebody, for example, accused of ripping people off and they have blown off many good faith efforts to comment, and you know they're going to be at the courthouse Monday morning answering some of this, not at Home Depot or
Sure,
Dowd.
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, you know, I had one, I mean, this is probably the most bizarrely like explicit situation. We were trying to talk to somebody and I had that conversation with him and he actually said, well, what does that mean? And nobody had ever asked me that question before. I was always sort of like unspoken. I said, well, I guess it was an attorney. I guess I would try to go to your law office and ask the receptionist if you would admit me to speak to you. And if that didn't work, I guess perhaps I'd find out when you had a court hearing and I would catch up to you there. Or if you didn't have any court hearings for the next month, maybe I'd have to wait in the parking lot and try to get you on the way out. What I really would try to avoid is a situation where, for example, you know, your family was there. I don't want to get you, you know, walking out to dinner with your family. That's, you know, that's not fair to anybody. So he said, you know, well, do whatever you have to do. And it's like, okay, thanks. We drove up to his office. I asked the receptionist to speak to him, and he came out. And he did the interview. So, you know, I think he realized, okay, I really did show up like I said I was. And the next step was probably catching up with him. You don't want to, you know, I mean, again, if you're the attorney in that situation, you don't really want a news crew catching up to you at the courthouse and doing this in front of people. So, you know, you give them the opportunity to try to do it with some dignity. And, you know, because I'm not out there to humiliate. I'm not out there to embarrass. I'm out there to elicit facts and to inform the public.
There's also the issue of personal safety. Our former editor was very concerned about reporters getting shot. You know, reporters getting, you know, these days that's a concern.
Okay, so Jennifer has a good question. Has anyone worked in getting information out of child services? Do you have any tips for approaching these types of items and trying to get folks to actually talk on the record?
Those are really, really tough stories to do. If you can do them, but it's excruciating because you're going to have to find somebody on the inside who is willing to talk to you confidentially. It's the only real, or leak you confidential documents, because otherwise it's excruciatingly difficult.
What I have done in those cases is I will try to go to the state agency that oversees child services so that at least I can get some data and some background. But I agree with Walt, those stories are very, very difficult.
And we all know that with the Valva case here on Long Island, if anyone's followed it. Okay, this is from Alan. Any suggestions to learn more about investigative reporting, such as courses, etc.? I'm a freelancer who hasn't done too much but wants to learn more. Thanks. And he says, great panel.
I strongly recommend IRE if you haven't gone there. Investigative Reporters and Editors, that's a great place to start. If you want to learn more about computer-assisted reporting, NICAR, the National Institute for Computer-Assisted Reporting, does a boot camp that's also very good.
I second that. The other thing about IRE is they have a national conference every year toward the end of June somewhere, and I think it's in Orlando this year maybe, but they also have regional conferences. So you can go and just do a day or a weekend, and there's some very valuable things you can learn at these regional conferences. You don't have to go to the national conference.
That's really helpful. I'd like to attend that. Okay, from Lillian, I hope I'm saying that correctly. As a writer for my university student newspaper, I hear rumors around campus that I want to investigate further for a potential story. My issue is if I discover the school is doing something wrong, it's intimidating being the person writing the story and exposing the issue while also continuing to go to the school. Any advice? That's a good question.
You want to go first on this one?
No, you go ahead.
No, that's such a tough one because student journalists with some recent court decisions don't have quite as much protection as professional journalists do, and I do understand the trepidation. I guess if you're exposing it, you would want to make sure that you have concrete evidence. What you don't want to do, especially, is go out and do a story like that. That's in general, you don't want to do a story that you're 95% sure of, right? You want to be 100% sure in general, but obviously that's especially true in a situation like this. And I think again, being fully transparent and you're out there to try to report the truth. You're not out there to push an agenda. I don't know how good that advice is, but it's kind of all I've got.
I think that's very good advice. There's also the Student Press Law Center, which has provides a lot of support for students, and I would reach out to them. But it's scary. I just did a story about a doctor who is from my community, and I was very worried about the blowback. But it turned out I was very worried about the impact of the story on his family and his son, whom my son knew. And it turned out my worries were misplaced because everyone I know thought the story was a good one. They were shocked by it, and they thought it was an important story to do. And I'm talking about non-journalists. So
right. People do try to intimidate from time.
Oh
to time.
yeah.
I had a guy who was a mid-level mobster who just while we were setting up for an interview, say he had been in my hometown the other day, and he was driving past my house and gave me the address. And it's like, okay, so you can look up property tax records just like I can. Congratulations. I think once you let them get into your head, it could be a problem. You have to just persevere as best you can.
But it is realistic. I wouldn't, if you feel uncomfortable or
Sure.
you feel nervous, listen to that, because it's not unrealistic to worry about that.
No, I would agree with that. You don't want to put yourself in harm's way. You just can't be scared off from doing the story.
Right.
Okay, we have, there are so many stories to pursue and never enough time or resources. How do you know when to let a story go or abandon it? When do you hit that point? That's from Lucy.
It's sometimes it's a risk reward thing. What's the upside on the story? what's the potential impact of the story? If it's a story that doesn't have as much impact, then you let it go sooner. If it's a story that you really believe in, you keep pushing it. I don't know if I would say abandon it as much as, okay, let's just put it on hold. We don't have enough right now. Let's put it on hold. We'll come back to it when we have more.
I would agree with Walt. I couldn't put it any better.
Okay, the next question. Sorry, I was just writing out NICAR for Jennifer had asked. So I just sent that. That's the National Institute for Computer Assisted Reporting, right?
Right.
Oh, I think, did I skip one? Hold on one second. There's so many. Oh, Erin Stevenson. She works for Newsday and she's on the press club board. Have you
Right.
had any stories you really wanted to do, but your editors or news directors said no? If so, were you able to do it at a later time?
That's a great question. I get asked that frequently, and the answer is a little bit nuanced. I mean, I don't own the television station. I obviously have a boss. Everything is everything is a collaboration. I pitch the idea for an investigation. They will occasionally say no to the idea. But and then I do work for for that person, and I respect their judgment. However, I don't think I've ever had a situation in my career where it's been done in the way that I think that question might, be intended. I pitch a story and the news director thinks it's okay. I'd rather have you, usually I'm pitching 4 or 5 stories at a time. We'll have like a quarterly meeting. The one I like the most may not be the one they like. And it's okay. I'll come back and I'll pitch it again later. Or I'll move on from it if it's not that important to me. I've never had that story that I really want to do, that I really think is hugely important, and I'm being steered away from it. No, I've never, I'm unfortunate, I've never had that happen. Nobody has ever kind of been afraid or, been politically influenced and not wanting to let me do a story.
I have had that. And what I've done is I've tried to recast the story, or
Right.
I've put it on hold and come back later and pitched it in a
Yeah.
slightly different way.
Right, but I think that when that happens, it's because whatever, you sold the story, they didn't like it. I mean, for me at least, it hasn't been that I felt like, we don't want to do this because it'll alienate a powerful person or anything like that. When I pitched Justice Delayed, the story about the kids being, fighting a 30-year battle for justice after they were sexually abused while in custody, I had to sell that one a few times. Because I got the original objection, which is it was 30 years ago. What are we going to accomplish now? And it's and to Audrey Gruber's credit, my boss, I mean, she now talks about how I kept pushing back on it until she eventually just let me do it, and how good the piece turned out. I think there it was just she didn't see it the same way I did. It was a good story at the time. It wasn't that we're friends with this person, we don't want to make the governor mad. I've never had that. At least I don't think so.
All right, I think we're done with those, but I have 2 more. So this actually came from talking to Erin Stevenson this morning. If you wait too long to air something or publish it, do you get nervous someone else will have it? Or have you not necessarily been ready, but you found out someone else is sniffing around and that kind of spurred your bosses to say, we got to get this out right away?
Yes, and yes. So, and it's one of the problems, is especially when you're trying to do print and video and online. There are a lot of different components, and so yeah.
And I've also had stories we were working on, but they weren't the front burner story. We had other stories taking priority, and the story just sort of like got past its shelf life. It's like it's no longer really worth doing. So I guess we just move on. It happens.
So what I try to do in a situation, if a story has been delayed for whatever reasons, I try to come up with a news peg, and I try to have multiple news pegs, so if this news peg is passed, a recent story I did, there was a court hearing, and that was the peg. Well, they held it beyond the court hearing. So then the records became recently released records. So you try to come up with things to keep it fresh and keep it newsy.
Right, or a different angle,
Yeah.
to it. I mean, maybe the thing you were originally investigating, the law has changed, but you knew what the problem was before, and now has the new law really made a difference? You can come back a year later.
I'm curious, you guys are covering some really, really very, serious, emotionally charged stories. Have you ever been threatened? Have you ever faced serious blowback? I'm sure you've been threatened with lawsuits, because I think all journalists have, but has anything kind of frightening ever happened?
Yeah, all the time.
Can you explain?
Yeah, I mean, it happens. I think what bothers my wife more than it bothers me, because when she finds out that it's happened. I've always felt bad for the families in that situation, because they didn't really. I mean, they married us, but didn't really sign up for threats.
Well, my husband, on the other hand, gets a charge out of it. I've had people drive over my lawn. I've had people call me in the middle of the night. I've had people threaten to hurt me. And there was this one time, this person was very angry and threatening to come to my home. And I had to call the police, and I literally sent a detective to watch my house that night. And the guy shows up and knocks on the door, and I'm in my pink bathrobe and my fuzzy slippers. And he comes in because he wants to see the backyard and everything. And my husband says to him, "Are you packing?" He goes, "Yeah." He goes, "What are you carrying?" So they had this whole talk about guns, but my only concern was, I said, "What precinct do you work in?" Because if he had worked in a particular precinct that I knew was compromised, I would have said, "Get the hell out of here." And he was smart. "No, I work in the 3rd precinct." I said, "Do you know Jimmy Burke?" "Well," and he was dancing. But after he was vetted thoroughly by both of us, I went to bed and he watched the house. So
we do have just really quickly, because I did promise you guys we'd be done at 8. This is from Lucy. What advice would you give younger reporters to protect their mental health while reporting on challenging stories? And yes, there's a growing awareness of this. Yep.
I'm glad that in the industry there's more of an awareness of it. It's tricky. I think you want to, as best as possible, maintain a work-life balance. It's very easy with this type of reporting, and the advice I'm giving is not necessarily always advice I followed myself. You want to avoid getting too obsessed, with the story where it's all you're thinking about. It does require a certain amount of that, but you also need to be able to unplug a little and spend time with your family and enjoy that time, and not have, you have to at a certain point allow yourself, a couple of hours where you're not just obsessing over the piece. I think when you sort of method act the story, if you will, it's all you're thinking about, it can play havoc with your mental health.
I think you need to seek out like-minded colleagues. I think you need to talk to your colleagues, and you cannot do it by yourself. You have to seek out, and not everybody understands what we do as reporters, just period. And I think you need to find some kind of connection there. It's really, really important. And you need to talk to people who've been through it.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll end with David North's question. Have you ever been the victim of your own success? Has your name notoriety scared off a source, or has your notoriety interfered with your work? So your name recognition, I suppose, and you're known for investigative reporting.
Yeah.
I mean, it happens. Where it's really sort of frustrating is we're just wanting to do a story. We want to talk to somebody, and we don't. Again, I'm a big believer in the no surprises rule, but that's not necessarily that everybody believed that. So we were trying to talk to an assemblyman the other day, and he was all set to do the interview, and then I guess he found out it was it was going to be me. And then all of a sudden he was busy and he'd want to do it. And it's like, I finally said, it was like a nothing, quick turn story. It's like, let's just move on. It's not worth it on this particular story. But it's like, I think he was convinced that, I was out there, there was some sort of, I was going to make him look bad. I was going to attack his legislation. And that really wasn't the point of it.
I think yes, it does happen. I would agree. But what I've done in that situation is I've partnered with another reporter. I've
Right.
been working on some stories recently with another reporter where, they thought I was the bad person and they thought he was going to be so much nicer. They are sadly mistaken because they really didn't bargain for what they got with him. And so I think there are ways around it, and you just have to find the ways around it. You're an
Yeah.
investigative reporter. Your job is to get
Yeah.
around obstacles.
Right. I mean, in the story I was talking about, it was sort of a quick turn, and so we don't talk to him, we can talk to somebody else, and it was fine. But yeah, if it's an investigation and they don't want to, yes, they have their backup more. But it's a double-edged sword. It cuts it goes both ways. When Karen, who often does a lot of the early phone calls, will say, "Hi, I'm Karen. I'm with News 12. I work with Walt Kane and Kane in Your Corner." When you're talking to a victim, they're all in all of a sudden. So it's much easier to get them because they believe that we're really going to do a story that's going to help them. You put that call into somebody who we're investigating, it instantly makes them much more reluctant than if it was somebody else. But at the same time, you try to convince them that, look, we know there are multiple sides to the story. We're trying to report the truth. We're going to be fair. If you don't have anything to hide, then let's do it.
So I'll end with the best advice I ever got from my reporter friends when I became a reporter was at the end of an interview, always say, is there anything you'd like to add? Because 98% of the time you get the best soundbite or the best quote. So I'll ask you guys, is there anything, Walt or Sandra, that you'd like to add?
One of the things that I've learned over the years is, and this is a little bit in the weeds, but anonymous sources are dangerous. You want to use them as, you need them sometimes, but if you can get somebody on the record, it's always better than somebody who's confidential. And in fact, one of the things, if you're doing TV, especially, you see it, but you also read it in newspapers. There'll be the profile of the one person who has a problem, and then there'll be the little pivot line. Smith isn't alone. We talked to a dozen other people. It's better if those other people are people who told you the story on the record, even if you're not putting the name in. Because if somebody attacks your story and your one named source is discredited, you have a dozen other people by name. If you think I've got the one person on camera, I don't really, the others, that background is fine because they are corroborating. If your one on camera source gets, their credibility attacked, you don't have other names to point to. So on camera, on camera is better than off camera. On the record is better than background. Always try to get it as public as you can.
Great advice, Sandra.
I can't match that. That's pretty good. What I would say is, if you're thinking about investigative reporting, stop thinking and just do it. Period.
Thank you guys. This was great. I could talk to you for 3 more hours. I hope everyone enjoyed it. This isn't paid, so we really appreciate you guys volunteering your time to do this. I just find these so, Sandra had spoken, and both of you had spoken at an SPJ panel, I don't know, 2 years ago, maybe. It was wonderful. And every time I hear from you guys, I learn something else new. So thank you.
You guys in Long Island are very lucky to have Sandra. She is.
New Jersey ditto
for giant. She absolutely is.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.